class, we talked about defining and measuring variables in terms of constructs and operational definitions, so how we define them. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the details of measurement, some of the more detailed oriented things about measurement. And in particular, we're going to talk about validity and reliability. And so operational definitions, as we talked about last class, is an indirect measure of measuring something that we can't directly measure. So the issue that we run into is, how do we know if it's a good measurement? And so researchers have developed these two general criteria to evaluate the quality of any measurement procedure. They are validity and reliability. And so one issue that we look at is the consistency of a relationship. Okay, so we need to determine the consistency of a relationship by computing a correlation between two measures. So we take two scores, so one score from each new measure, or so, for example, we have one individual who takes a new measure and a well-established measure. And so we have their score on the new measure and we have their score on the well-established measure. And we plot 1 point per person in a scatter plot. And what we look for is a consistent pattern. So if there's a positive relationship, two measurements change together in the same direction. So as your score on the new measure of depression goes up, so does your score on the Beck depression inventory, which is a well-established measure. If there's a negative relationship, then the two measures change in the opposite direction. So maybe you're establishing a new measure of happiness, and you want to make sure it's not related to depression, or you'd expect it to be related in the opposite direction. So as your score on the Beck depression inventory increases, your score on happiness decreases. And so when we're looking at consistency, we're trying to figure out, or we can establish the consistency of a relationship by computing a correlation. Okay, so again, this is a little bit more about correlations. And so if we stick with this depression example, we've got a positive relationship here. And so we've got our new measure of depression on the x-axis and the Beck depression inventory on a y-axis, and each dot represents one individual, and you can see individuals who score low on the new inventory score low on the Beck inventory. Individuals who score high on the new inventory also score high on the depression inventory. We might also find a negative relationship, which means the measures are related in an opposite way. So maybe we have our new measure of depression here and happiness. They should be related, but they should be related in the opposite direction. And sure enough, people who are not very depressed on our new measure score high on happiness, where people who are high on our new measure of depression score low on happiness. And then the third possibility that we might find is no consistent relationship, and maybe our new measure of depression, we might want to confirm that it's not related to self-esteem. So this is important because it shows that the two constructs are independent and measuring different things. Okay, so one of the big things we need to establish is the validity of a measurement, and validity is really a measure of truthfulness. Is it accurately capturing the variable it's supposed to measure? So we mentioned IQ tests last class, but the question is, does an IQ test measure intelligence accurately? It measures something, but is it actually measuring intelligence? So there's a couple of different ways we can get at the validity of a measure, and thinking about, is a measure assessing what it's supposed to? So one is face validity. Face validity is kind of the simplest, but least scientific. And the question is, do questions sound like they're measuring something that they're supposed to, right? So an IQ test should ask questions that require logic, reasoning, memory, all the things that we think make up intelligence. If an IQ test is asking about your favorite flower, at least in terms of the face value, in terms of face validity, it doesn't sound like it's measuring IQ. Another aspect of validity is concurrent validity. So this is asking, do scores from a new measure relate to established measures? Okay, so this is kind of, if you have a new measure of depression, does it relate to existing measures of depression? If you're making a new IQ test, your new test, scores on your new test should be related to scores on a well-established IQ test, like the Wechsler skips. There's always a lot of online quizzes going on, and I think they're a really good example of kind of some of the potential problems with quizzes. So for example, I'm not sure how valid the construct of which 90s sitcom are you is real, but do things like what would you eat right now and your favorite 90s score really tell you what 90s sitcom you are? So I think in terms of face validity, asking about favorite food is probably not directly going to relate to which TV show you are. So a lot of these BuzzFeed quizzes have really bad face validity. And I think this is an old article now, but I think it's kind of funny example of how problematic these are. So Shirley Manson takes a BuzzFeed's quiz about which alt-rock girl are you and discovers she's not herself, right? So clearly the person that this quiz was supposed to be, or one of the people this quiz was supposed to be about, isn't even getting herself. Not very valid, not a great measure of what it's supposed to measure. Okay, so a couple of other ways that we can look at the validity of a measure. What is predictive validity? So your scores should relate to or predict actual behavior. IQ scores should predict GPA, right? We would expect that it predicts other related behavior. Another important one is construct validity. And so construct validity measures does the questionnaire measure what it's theoretically designed to measure? So scores on your test should relate to other constructs in the ways that you would expect. So it should be positively related to things that the variable or construct is positively related to. It should be negatively related to things your variable is negatively related to. So if you have a measure of intelligence that is negatively related to student GPA, there might be something wrong, right? Because we generally expect that the smarter, more intelligent you are, the higher your GPA. So this construct validity is looking at how does it relate to other constructs, and does it do so in an expected way? Kind of related to that is convergent validity. And so this is the idea that you get similar scores on measures of related constructs. Okay, your attitudes towards exotic pets should be negatively correlated with your attitudes about animal abuse. So is it related to other things that are related in a positive way? Divergent validity is that measures of different constructs don't go together. No. Okay, go in the kitchen. She's in there. Your measure of attitudes about exotic pets shouldn't be related to your attitudes about the military. They're totally different. There should be no relationship there. Likewise, with the depression inventory example, your measure of depression should not be related to self-esteem. It should indicate that they are separate constructs. Okay. The next issue is reliability. And so reliability has to do with consistency of the measurement. So the idea is that you should generally have similar results every time it's used. If the same individual takes the same test in the same condition, they should have identical or nearly identical scores. So there's always going to be some error in measurement, and that leads to inconsistency. And so when we conceptualize reliability, we have the measured score, which is someone's actual outcome. And the measured score is made up of their true score, this kind of not actual thing that we can get, but kind of our theoretical, everyone has a true level of intelligence. And so we're trying to get at that, their true score plus error. We assume that most of the error is random rather than systematic. But there are several sources of error. So one might be observer error. So the individual who's making the measurements can introduce human error, especially if we're doing observational research, which we'll talk about a little more later in the semester. There's also the possibility of environmental changes. So it's difficult to obtain exactly identical circumstances. things like the temperature of the room, the research assistant who's running the test, things like that have the potential to change responses. And then finally, there's the potential for participant changes to lead to error. So changes in the individual who's taking the test between measurement, maybe degree of focus, right? One day they're in a great mood and super focused. The next day there's something going on at home and they can't pay attention. And so generally what we want when we've got a measure, we want small amounts of error, which means it's a highly reliable measure. High error means it's a not very reliable measure. So there's a couple of different ways that we can measure reliability. One is through successive measurement. So the idea here is that we give the test twice at 2 different times. So this is sometimes called retest reliability. You give the exact same questionnaires to a large sample 2 different times, and you want kind of the same relative position in the group. So we don't necessarily expect each individual to have exactly the same score, but we expect that, you know, if you're in the top 10% of an IQ test the first time you take it, you should also be in the top 10% the second time you take it. And so generally to assess this, we'll compute a correlation coefficient between individuals' 2 scores. A high correlation indicates high reliability. Another strategy is simultaneous measurements. And so one example of this is inter-rater reliability, which we use with observations. So I worked on an observational study a while ago, and we were observing kids' recess observations and coding them for how much engaging behavior they had, how much engagement they had with other people. And so what we would do to assess inter-rater reliability is about 30% of our observations, 2 of us would watch together. So we'd observe the same child at the same time, write down our responses independently, and then compare them after the fact to make sure that when we watched the same kid engaging in the same behavior, we coded it in the same way. And again, higher correlations between those 2 scores indicate higher reliability. Another way you can do this is looking at internal consistency. So if you don't want to give people the test twice, you can do a strategy called split half reliability. So most tests have multiple items or questions, and no single item is enough. But we can compare responses to different questions or different parts of the survey to see how they relate to the whole. So that in general is the principle of internal consistency. With split half reliability, you split the tests in half, calculate the scores for each half of the test, and see how they relate. And again, if it's a highly reliable test, there should be a high correlation. Okay, just an example. So a ruler is highly reliable. When we measure a table to be 30 inches one day, we expect it to be 30 inches long when we measure it the next day. Every single time you use the ruler, if you're using it with the same object, you get the same measure. If, however, we're using a measuring tape that was elastic, it would be very unreliable, right? Because you can stretch it. So one day the table might be measured at 30 inches, 28, and the next day it might be 28 inches, depending on how tight you stretch the elastic. And so this is the issue with reliability. We want to get that same measurement every single time. So both reliability and validity are important. In general, we consider reliability a prerequisite for validity. You can't have a valid measure if it's not reliable. If you don't get the same response every single time, then it's not going to be a true response, right? Because reliability is about consistency, where validity is kind of about truth. A measure can be valid without being reliable. So consistency of measurement is not a guarantee of validity. So just because you get the same answer every single time doesn't guarantee that it is valid. It doesn't guarantee it's the right answer. So I think a target is a good analogy for this. So I'd encourage you to pause the video and think about which one of these targets is reliable, which one of these targets is valid. So go ahead and pause and think about that and label these. Remember that reliability is about consistency and valid is about whether it's accuracy. Okay, so if we look at this first one, it is neither reliable nor valid. You're not hitting the same spot on the target every single time, and you're certainly not hitting the center of the target. If we look at this second one, it is reliable, but it is not valid. You're generally hitting the same spot on the target every time, but you're not hitting the center of the target. So it's not a very good measure if this were a measure. You know, if you consistently got the same score every time, but it's an inaccurate score, not terribly useful. Finally, the last one is both reliable and valid. You're hitting the same score every time, you're hitting the center of the target, and you're hitting the center of the target, which means it's valid. So it's reliable, consistent, and accurate. All right. The final, I believe, thing we're going to talk about in here is scale of measurement. Okay, so another big issue that we're going to need to figure out, or that researchers need to figure out, is what set of categories responses will be in. So kind of what the response options are, and that determines your procedure for assigning people to categories and things like that. So measurement is a procedure for classifying individuals, and so scale of measurement is the set of categories used for classification. So we need to think about the sets of categories and the procedures for assigning individuals. So there are 4 different types of measurement scales. Nominal scales represent qualitative differences in the variables measured. They're not numerical distinctions. So things like male, female, political party, eye color. We can group people based on nominal scales, but there's no one is better than the other. Ordinal scales are ordered sequentially and represent kind of different ranks. So for example, rate your first, second, or third choice, or t-shirt sizes, small, medium, or large, socioeconomic status, lower, middle, upper class, or upper socioeconomic status. But we have to be careful with ordinal scales because while there's a clear rank, if we take socioeconomic status, upper, middle, and lower, there's a clear rank, but people in middle socioeconomic status don't necessarily make twice what people in lower socioeconomic status make. So that kind of differences between groups is really unclear with an ordinal scale. Interval or ratio scales. Interval scales have no absolute zero, but they're numerical. And they have a series of equal intervals like inches on a ruler. So things like IQ tests or sometimes personality test scores will give you a number, but with interval, 0 doesn't really mean anything, right? So in contrast, ratio scales have a true 0. Okay, so 0 means something. So something like your commute to work. How long is your commute? 0 means you work from home. Or the number of correct answers on a test. 0 means you got none correct. Where a 0 on an IQ test doesn't necessarily mean that you have absolutely no intelligence. Okay, this is a little graphic that I think might be kind of helpful, at least in distinguishing between some of them. So nominal is an unordered description. I'm a turtle, I'm a snail, I'm a butterfly. Ordinal is ordered descriptions. And so we'll see some ordinal responses on questionnaires and things like that. I'm unhappy, I'm okay, I'm awesome. Your book doesn't really talk about binary, although it's worth mentioning, here with binary, it's just 2 groups. I'm extinct, or I'm not. And the reason that we talk about these is because the level of measurement that you use determines what you can do with the data afterwards. In a quantitative study, which is what ours will be, having an interval or ratio scale is preferred so you can do statistical analyses and hypothesis testing. So with interval or ratio scales, you can use basic arithmetic, and you can do statistical analyses, which enable us to do hypothesis testing. scores from ordinal scales are not compatible with basic arithmetic or most statistical analyses. There are some you can do, like chi-squared, but generally we tend to do more of our hypothesis testing with interval or ratio scales. It's sometimes hard to know whether we have an interval or a ratio scale. And kind of how equivalent those number differences are. So for example, if you use a Likert scale, a scale of 1 to 5, 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree, we don't necessarily know how big the differences are between numbers. Convention, though, is to treat a Likert scale like an interval scale. So many of your response options for your final projects will be Likert scales, and we will treat them like interval scales and do statistical tests, even if some may argue that they're technically ordinal. Okay. Scales ability in comparing different measurements. So what can you do with each? With a nominal scale, you can reveal whether there are differences between groups, but you can't, it just says which groups are different. Or what the different rates are. In ordinal scale, you can indicate the direction of the difference, so which is more and which is less. In an interval scale, you can determine the direction of a difference and the magnitude. And then a ratio, you can also look at ratios. But again, intervals and ratios, we tend to use the same kind of analyses. Okay. Another aspect is the modality of measurement. So often there are multiple ways that we can operationally define a construct, and we can get the information from different methodologies and modes of measurement. For our final project, we're going to be using, I think, pretty much exclusively self-report where we ask participants to direct questions to study behavior. We ask participants direct questions to study behavior. This is often the easiest and most direct way to get at things, but there are some questions about the validity of self-report. Will people be honest? Are they actually self-aware of what you're studying? If we ask teenagers about sexual behavior, there might be issues about the truthfulness of their responses. If we ask people about, I don't know, how much they value really obscure things, they might not ever really think about it and might not give you a great response. But a lot of times, the only way to find out about something is to ask, right? So we can't necessarily read people's minds, and so if we directly ask them, we can at least get some insight. Another strategy is physiological measures, which we think of as kind of manifestations of the underlying construct. So things like skin response or brain activity provide us with kind of objective measures that are reliable and are accurate. But there are some questions sometimes about the validity, right? So if you have some kind of a skin response in a specific situation, is it because of anxiety, which is how we're interpreting it maybe, or is it because of the strangeness of the lab situation or something totally unrelated? So there's some questions about the validity of physiological measures. Also, they're very expensive, or often can be very expensive. Another strategy is observations. Observing overt behavior, actually recording the behaviors associated with the construct. So this can provide researchers with a ton of options. We can select the behaviors that are the best for defining and measuring our construct. But there are issues with behaviors being only temporary or situational indicators of the underlying construct. So some issues with validity too, and we'll talk more about observations later on. One thing that we can do to kind of compensate for the challenges of each measure is use multiple types of measurement. So if we do behavioral observations and self-report, if, for example, I'm interested in shyness, I observe kids' behaviors on the playground and record how much they engage with other kids. And I also ask those kids about how shy and anxious they feel when they're engaging with other people. Then I get a really good picture of how shy they actually are. Now, this makes things more complicated in terms of statistical analysis and interpretations. We might get a situation where kids say they're not shy, but they spend almost no time engaging with other kids. So there's certainly downsides to the multiple methods too. But there are ways we can deal with this, and this can be really powerful in terms of a tool. Okay, there are some issues with sensitivity sometimes and what we call range effects. And so the idea is that sometimes we have a measure that's not very good because it's not sensitive enough to detect a difference between groups if there really is one. So for example, a ceiling effect happens when everyone gets a really high score on your measure and you can't see any differences between people because everyone does really well. I did an experiment a couple of years ago where we were looking at how well people remembered something after a mini lecture. And so we gave them a lecture and then gave them 5 test questions. And we were hoping that there would be differences in their scores on the test questions depending on how on what type of note-taking they did. But the problem was that the questions were really easy and everyone got them all right? So we had a ceiling effect. We couldn't see any differences between note-taking method because everyone did really well. So it doesn't really allow a possibility to see differences or allow a possibility for people to do better. Likewise, a floor effect, same thing, but at the low end of the scale. If everyone scores really, really low, people aren't going to get any worse and you're not going to see any differences between groups. Okay. Another thing we have to think about is artifacts. So artifacts are a non-natural feature that accidentally gets introduced by someone being observed. So this happens kind of in the process of studying something. You change it because of something the experimenter or researcher has done. So one component of this is experimenter bias, where maybe the measurements are influenced by the experimenter's expectations regarding the outcome of the study. So there's a couple of things that we can do to kind of protect against experimenter bias. One is standardize or automate the experiment. The computer reads the instructions instead of having a research assistant read the instructions. A single blind study is another strategy where the research study is conducted by an experimenter who doesn't know the expected results. Okay, so the experimenter or the person who's actually talking to the participants doesn't know the expected results or doesn't know what group the participant's in. If we're doing like a drug study, maybe the person who asks people about their symptoms doesn't know whether the person got the treatment or the placebo, and therefore their expectations can't influence the reports. A double-blind study, in a double-blind study, neither the experimenter nor the participant knows the expected results or which groups. So if we're talking about a drug trial, this is the kind of the easiest example. If you have a drug and a placebo pill that looks exactly like the regular pill, the participant doesn't know whether they're getting the placebo and neither does the researcher. Similarly, if we think about like vaccine trials, neither the experimenter injecting the vaccine, nor the participant would know whether the person got the vaccine or the placebo. So this might be kind of coded by someone higher up or coded by someone uninvolved in the study, not directly talking to the participants, so that the experimenter expectations don't influence the finding, and also in a double-blind study so that the participants' expectations that it's going to work or not work don't influence their findings. Another issue that we could run into is demand characteristics. So these are cues or features about the study that suggest that to the participants the purpose and hypothesis of the study. So generally, research participants want to give experimenters good findings. They want to please the experimenter. And so if the experimenter or the setup gives participants hints, either intentionally or unintentionally, it can influence the way they respond. Another kind of different aspect of this is reactivity, which is the fact that just knowing that you're being observed can change your behavior. So especially when doing observational studies, it's important to be kind of discreet or let participants get used to you before you start recording behavior, because that may influence your behavior. And there's a couple of different roles that people might take when they know they're being observed. So The good subject role wants to support the experimenter's hypothesis. A negativistic subject role is where they act contrary to the hypothesis. They think no one's going to engage in helping behavior, or they think everyone's going to engage in helping behavior, but I'm not going to because I know that's what they're studying. The apprehensive subject role, I just want everyone to see me as being good. In the faithful subject role, I'm going to do exactly what they say. This seems like an ideal situation, but it can be problematic if that's not their actual behavior. So these kinds of issues are especially problematic in studies that are conducted in the lab where people are really aware that they're being studied. In field studies, in a natural environment, we can sometimes be a little more discreet and help address some of those things. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Make sure if you haven't already, read chapter 3. You've got a chapter in APA manual. You've got your SPSS lesson. I have posted all of the SPS data. I believe you should be able to see it in the Files tab in Canvas. The only thing you need to submit for this week, due on Sunday, is the measurement and recruitment plan. And again, coordinate with your group about that. And then next week, we will cover chapter 4 in our book.